we'll begin with the acknowledgement of the traditional owners, and I'm sitting on the land of the Turrbal and the Yugara people as First Nations owners of this land where QUT now stands, and we pay respect to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits. And we recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning. And here at QUT we acknowledge the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within our QUT community. Okay. You'll be seeing that we're covering the equivalent in this workshop this evening, the equivalent of modules 7, 8. So there are recordings up there of this and the other AIRS workshops, and of course a lot of self-paced learning resources there. So this evening we're going to be looking at coding and organising and categorising the literature that you've already started to gather, and the pre-activity was to start thinking about your coding system. Then we're going to look at bibliographic management software very briefly, and then the rest of the time we're talking about research data management, which is quite a different shift where AIRS goes in this third workshop to talk about research data management and its relationship to publications, etc. And then we'll get you to think about when you start to publish your papers, you'll need to clearly identify who you are, and we like all our students and academics to have a unique ORCID, Open Research Contributor ID, so we know who you are, and that'll be followed up in the AIRS 4 workshop. So as you're sort of speed reading and annotating these pieces of literature, perhaps you'll be either in a grid in Microsoft Word or Excel, or possibly you'd be using a field in customized field in EndNote, like the label field, to put in a code or a classification for the literature. And it just helps you to keep track of putting them in boxes in terms of, yes, these papers all have something in common that is key to my research question, or identify those themes. So yeah, there's really good examples in the online AIRS about how you would go about creating coding systems. You see here we've got an alpha system up here on the right, for annotating PDFs. You know, in this particular case, it's one document that might address a number of these areas that are important to your research question. And the illustration here on the bottom right is from what we call EndNote groups. EndNote has the ability, it's a reference management software, has the ability for you to manually assign papers to a particular attribute or group. And so in this case here, we've got attrition factors, performance impact, retention impact. They're the three big ideas. At the moment, there's 0 documents showing there, but they'll be added in as the researcher starts to categorize and organize their literature. And Jenny's said, yes, there are many systems out there, and yes, at module 7.4, so I should probably pull that up, about keeping notes and getting organized with your, and in fact, there's some videos here, some really good tips about how to organize your literature. And a lot of folks talk about they're taken with this latch approach to how to tame the literature dragon, from Dr. Inga Mewburn, who's the author of the Thesis Whisperers, who's very highly regarded in terms of research methodology in this country. All right. Okay, so typically this is your research question. What are the big ideas? The big ideas will all be able to be deconstructed into a sort of code, mentoring, mentoring of minorities, mentoring of university students, and in terms of successful completion of graduate degrees. So these are, in fact, if you look at the research question, the major subcomponents of the question. And these coding systems would be actually, you would be assigning those to each document that matched that category. Bibliographic research management software, give us a tick or a thumbs up if you've used any kind of bibliographic management system like reference management. EndNote, use Mendeley, two good ones, two obviously good ones. There are plenty of, they're the two that are supported here at QUT, and there's a third one I'll show you here on the HiQ website. Reference management software. This is the page I'm showing you here. EndNote, Mendeley, paper piles are really fabulously easy thing to use if you're working in the Google environments, if you're authoring with Google Docs, using Google Drive, co-authoring papers, etc. And it works much, much better in the cloud than some of these earlier iterations. But EndNote is probably the most fully featured, powerful bit of software that's around, and we have a university-wide site license for that and have had for years. And in a rival product, in my opinion, not as fully featured, is the Mendeley product. So back to the PowerPoint. What can they do? They're essentially databases, but specialized databases that handle bibliographic data as opposed to things like text file numbers, etc. Yes, a lot of ways of importing directly from databases, exporting, and sharing, particularly sharing with supervisors, sharing with co-authors, that type of thing. Jenny suggests get advice from your thesis supervisor on their preferred bibliographic management software. And software like Mendeley and EndNote can manage the full text, the PDFs, etc. So yes, I've just shown you where you would, the instructions for installing EndNote, Mendeley, etc. It's in the, follow the link from the HiQ website. Okay, so, and also there's a fabulous comparison table of, there they are, Paperpile, EndNote, Mendeley, Zotero, BibTeX, which might be using something like JabRef as a GUI for folks working in maths. LaTeX, if you don't know what it is and you're not authoring papers, and you don't need to worry about BibTeX, because so you might be looking at EndNote, Paperpile, or Mendeley, or Zotero as a nice web-based, easy to use bibliographic management software. And there's a lot of others, but they're the ones that are supported here at QUT. All right, so research data management. So perhaps this is the module that students just beginning their research journey struggle with the most, if they haven't really fully fleshed out what their research method will be and what type of data they'll be generating and collecting. But we like you to think very early on in your research journey about these big questions, particularly folks doing doctoral work, PhD work. You're typically expected to add new knowledge to the pool, and that involves some serious research where you're actually going out and collecting data, whether it's qualitative data or quantitative data, or scientific experiment type data that's mapped in logbooks. But you've got to have systems to manage this, and particularly if the questions around research integrity, we want you folk all to be aware of the requirements of research students in terms of managing your research data effectively, and also how long it's got to be kept for, and other requirements. So that is typically 5 years for research that doesn't result in a patent. But yes, there are very important considerations around commercial, legal, ethical considerations about storing and potential reuse of research data. And it's certainly the reuse of research data is something that we to aim for, if at all possible, providing it doesn't breach sort of research ethics, confidentiality of people participating in as your research cohort, etc. And even if there is that potential for individuals to be identified in a research data set, perhaps if you're thinking about it early enough, you would have a plan to be able to share a de-identified version of your research data that other researchers could then pick up and use and run with, but still preserve the privacy of your participants in your study, etc. There's ways of anonymizing data sets to permit sharing. All right, okay. Yeah, so think of particularly things like medical research, any kind of research around vaccines or medical interventions. When it's publicly funded research, the governments and the funding bodies want the data sets that the researchers of today have created to live on for so many good reasons. Things like being able to verify the integrity that the research was done properly and correctly, but also in terms of other researchers that follow you to extend the research. So the funding bodies are looking for more bang for their buck in terms of research data sharing, and the experience has been that it's all about getting your research papers cited, and the experience has shown that as well as publishing your research, if you share your original research data sets, it should smooth the path of the reviewing. A lot of reviewers these days want to check your numbers, run the numbers themselves, see if they come up with the same results, so replicate the results. Or, B, as I say, other researchers will use your research as a springboard to build on theirs. So the gold standard, wherever possible, is reuse of data, research data. Okay, so now in this slide here, we are actually alerting you to the fact that particularly folks working in the qualitative research methodologies, there's a fabulous resource called SAGE Research Methods, not only qualitative research, but very strong in resources of people who, if they have to do a case study, a survey, quantitative statistics, quantitative methods in terms of how to best to analyze statistics. A lot of really good stuff at this specialist database called SAGE Research Methods Online. The SAGE publishing house has been around for over 50 years, and they've always had this niche about publishing books in research methodology. So do go and check it out. And there's a lot in SAGE Research methods online about collecting and sharing data as well. Now, I talked about using other researchers' data sets as a springboard for your own. So you're beginning your research journey. So you may well be using some kind of standard research data set as a benchmark. So you'll be looking for those. We do have links now from here, specialized guides for finding research data sets in social science, research data sets in health and STEM. And we actually have a research data librarian specialist employed here, but there it is displayed. Okay, so like research data classes, we've got experimental data, lab generated tests and experiments, typically these days captured in lab instruments are sort of typically linked to computers and the data collections organized if people are working in life sciences, in chemistry, etc. QUT is very much into simulation of phenomenon, as opposed to, like, if you use the example of fluids, fluid mechanics, we don't have a lot of test bed sort of scale models of things. We do use computational simulation of phenomena, special software like Fluent, etc., for folks working in the data sets. Folks working in typically, possibly more in human research, human observational research of humans, or potentially of scientific phenomenon. Derived research, basically starting with some raw data and adding value to it. And then also potentially there's a lot of reference data sets around, particularly the areas the folks I work with in robotic vision. They have a lot of standard research data sets that people, researchers will test their new novel algorithm against an established data set. And the examples of other reference data sets are things like the Hilda. So a lot of different examples there. And you can see in this column here that the type of collections, I guess, what you typically expect these data sets to be arranged in or formatted in. All right, now, what data sets might be generated and what file types and formats might be generated, and how would each of these data set be managed? So we've got video recordings, audio recordings, perhaps transcripts of interview, etc. Here we go. You've started to think about your research data collection, about issues about collection, privacy, security, and potentially sharing that won't compromise any kind of ethical clearance that you have. We had a question in the chat box that, are there services we can use that don't violate privacy if it's important to your research outcome that you do have a data set that is shareable, so people can replicate your research, check your findings? You would have, the privacy is really about the consent of the participants. So if that was important to you, then you'd have to design that into your ethical clearance. And it's one of the reasons we get you to think about research data collection this early on in your journey.
I agree, and the ethics committee is going to actually, put down what you intend to do, and the ethics committee will let you know if you've actually gone astray on any of what they deem as ethical.
Sort of fairly important that you've completed a research data management plan, at least started one, which is a living document. When you get to the stage 2, you're confronted with this 3 options about research data management plan. And I think the worst option for someone at stage 2 is the top one. I have not yet considered data management issues, but will do so before confirmation. I think, and I hope you agree, that the option down the bottom is the optimal at someone who's ready to pass that stage to hurdle that I have read the data management planning information, discussed it with my supervisor, and have completed the research data management plan, which is a word-based form that you get online and you get available through HiQ, the digital workplace. So definitely that's the way to go. And don't be put off by the fact that it's not a final document. It's a living document, your research data management plan, and you can just keep revisiting it through the course of your research journey and update it with more information once it becomes apparent, your research direction, your research method, etc. Okay, it's data management tool that you log in with your QET username and password, and you start your research data management plan. Do it ASAP. That'd be our advice. Okay, so let's talk about metadata and its importance for storage, reuse, and sharing of data. How important descriptions that goes in the metadata of the files or the research data collection, what a critical role it plays in terms of making your research data sets discoverable and reusable and not go to waste and live on after your research is finished. So metadata is the information about who owns it, technical information, how it's reused, how it was collected, and basically what it is and how you collected it and how others could potentially take advantage of it. So if you look at the sort of components of metadata, things like descriptive, if you like, it's the equivalent of what a library catalog is to a book that describes who the author of the data is or the creator of the data, who contributed it to it, what is it called, keywords important. You want people to discover this published research data set on the various platforms, and we'll look at a few of those platforms a little later on. So yes, and in terms of how it relates to scholarly publications that are out there, and when and where the data was collected. And in terms of structural data, about how many different versions of the data exist, and sometimes it's important for research to see how the various experiments, how many iterations, how many components, subcomponents of the data sets there are, and I can show you some examples of that too. A little bit related to the provenance in terms of the different versions or additions or generations of the data, and in terms of if it was created in proprietary software, but you're sharing an open source, you'd need to mention that the proprietary software that did do the collection or creation. And then, of course, the technical information about what type of file it is, what format it is, how large it is, what kind of software you'll need to open the file, open the data with and analyze it, and what equipment you might need to make sense or use of the data. And importantly, ownership of the data. You're the creator of the data. If it's your data, you own it. You want to make sure that you control the license governing the reuse of it. And typically we're talking about Creative Commons licenses, where you assert your ownership of the data set, but you invite folks to use it under various conditions. And typically the condition at the very least is that you want to be acknowledged as the creator of the data set in any publications or any value add that subsequent researchers make to your data set. And of course, in terms of if there's some limited sharing that you're allowed to do and preserve confidentiality, then you might share on the basis that the subsequent researcher enters into a confidentiality agreement to protect people's privacy, etc. Okay, so there is a question in the AIRS log about metadata. You need to address it in your AIRS log about what metadata is and what the function of metadata is. So, metadata can be the properties of a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet. If you go to properties, you can put in keywords and tags, etc. And there's plenty of examples here. Perhaps the original and the best metadata was the subject heading provided by the Library of Congress. I guess these things can all be ways of organizing and categorizing using metadata. Yeah, so you're thinking about when you're going to the trouble of doing a fulsome description of your metadata that you're hopefully addressing all these components. The more you invest into this, the more likely that your data set will be reused, and the more likely you'll achieve some degree of fame and notoriety in a good way in your research field because people have used your data set. In your AIRS log, 8C, identify and discuss 3 types of contextual metadata that helps make your metadata fair. And I'm pretty sure we will have right on the next slide a definition of what fair is. These are the important components that spell fair: findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And the link below is to the Australian National Data Service, a federal government funded body that that the Australian government and the research funders thought was so important, they set up this organisation called ANDS, which is about educating the research community of the importance of research data reuse and proper curation, etc. So that comes from ANDS, the Australian National Data Service. Okie doke. So, ready to move on. Okay, so just to perhaps flesh this out a bit, look at this record here in Research Data Finder to where I am at. This is a real life data set that has been shared through QUT Research Data Finder. In this particular case, it's a genetic data set of RNA sequencing for a particular type of cancer. And I did mention that particularly in the health and medical field, the governments love the fact that data sets can be reshared, reused and extended and shared. So just go back to the PowerPoint and see what it's asking of us. Can we look at this record and identify descriptive metadata, provenance metadata, technical and structural, and the rights and access? Research Data Finder is the officially sanctioned and endorsed place for QUT generated research to be catalogued, and it has the capacity to actually share the research data files as well. So between the bibliographic data that links to a publication by John Lai and others, marries up with, has this association with John Lai, and we could pretty much assume that between Jyotsna and John, they're responsible for actually collecting the research data, yeah? So that's a very good observation. So it is quite possible that there are researchers in the field of prostate cancer that would like to find some RNA sequencing of prostate cancers. And rather than reinvent the wheel, they'd like to find what is available out there. And so, yes, this should point them to the actual data set here. And folks, for searching and describing material, it's not just keywords. Key phrases often have so much more power than keywords. So a good example, and it's an introduction to this QUT research data finder that hopefully comes up high in all the academic search engines. And it's a way of linking QUT research data sets and linking them nicely to publications and other details here. So here we have a data set linking to a chapter of a book, etc., but the original data set behind. So moving on to answer all those questions, we get the whole thing deconstructed. There's your description. There's your provenance. Nothing too technical about this, except that PCs running in a Linux environment it possibly could have more technical information, but perhaps it's just sufficient. And in terms of, there's your Creative Commons license. About this has been set to Creative Commons by attribution. So please feel free to use this research data set, but make sure you give me credit for creating it. So that's the attribution component. And there are your metadata types deconstructed. Okay, so it's one of the questions in the log. Typically the answer is 5 years. It's very hard to know as you're starting your research journey if there's a potential for a patent. Perhaps some of that stuff in life sciences potentially could result in a pharmaceutical patent, which lasts for 25 years as opposed to a standard patent, which is only 20 years. So you can see that in that scenario, a research data set would have to be retained for an awful long time. So we're up to 32 years. So you'd have to make plans if you thought you were going to create a pharmaceutical product as a result of your research, securely, certainly not publicly, securely stored the research data associated with the grant of patent for 32 years, 7 years after the expiry of the pharmaceutical patent. But typically for most folks, the answer is I'm going to have to make plans to securely store and retain my data set, whether it's been digital format or in print format, for 5 years. And there's other rules for clinical trials. Okay, that's how long it must be retained for. So here's 3, 2, and 1. So what we've got here is we've got the working copy of Tracy's Queensland transport data, presumably something like traffic counts. You know, she would have a working copy. She would have a backup of that working copy, and she would have a master of the original data that she could return to at any time that hadn't been amended in any way. So the 3, 2, 1 storage rule. Now we want you, from purposes of research integrity, to make sure that your research data is kept in Australia on QUT authorized systems. So we're talking about QUT network storage, typically the R drive, research data storage service. Then if your data needs to be inspected at any time, that this is indeed where it's available for inspection and verification purposes. The QUT's research data storage service, which has a regular safety backup. Okay, research data storage service, RDSS, or the R drive for short, is your preferred place to go. If you've got large data sets, you might be taking advantages, and particularly needs to be shared in other institutions, across other institutions. You might be actually then putting a copy of your data set up on ARNet, Australian Academic Research Network's cloud store. QSIF stands for Queensland Computing Infrastructure. That's another cloud storage system designed for sharing. So those three are all preferred and endorsed storage options for data sets. These are where we want you to look to these in this order of storing your research data on these services here. Places we don't want you to look like standard, use the R drive instead. Google Drive, we're not in the Google ecosystem here. Dropbox, these are both very popular storage systems, but we don't endorse them for official QUT research. Storage is not part of the QUT ecosystem.
And note that about why used ARNet, because she was saving in RDSS and it's not available. RDSS is not available for external use.
Derived data results are shared securely with industry partners.
Yeah.
So if you need to share a data set, maybe it's with an industry partner, maybe it's with a journal reviewer or editor, you'd be looking to something like ARNet's cloud store, or well, I think that's where you'd go in your first instance. And then other researchers in the ecosystem outside of QUT, QSIF is an option as well. But I think, Jenny, between RDSS for local QUT use and ARNet Cloud Store, that's pretty much got everyone covered. Okay. So some examples other than QUT Research Data Finder, which is down here. It's probably your first go-to place. Well, it is your first go-to place, basically. We've been to QUT Research Data Finder there. That's where you'd look to go in the first instance, unless you are doing something highly specific or discipline-based in genetics. You might be using GenBank or Data One. I'll show you one if you're publishing the IEEE world. This is where electronic engineers share a lot of their data sets. If you potentially could share there, or if you're looking for data sets, that's another example. This is Figshare. It's a proprietary system that's used by a lot of folks around the place. Start with that one, and unless you have some really good reason not to use that, there's some of the other options available. Figshare, Dryad. Okay, to revisit that, those FAIR principles and the research data lifecycle, and as I say, wherever possible, publishing, preserving, reusing, and over here in the working space, you've got a verifiable, reliable, safe storage that's being backed up. And so the key to good research data management is all about planning from the early stages. So it has been our pleasure to work with you in this third workshop, which equates to modules 7, 8, and 9 of the online AIRS. For those of you participating in AIRS 4, could you please identify a journal in which you'd like to publish, aim high, aspire to say, well, one day I aspire to publish a journal article in this journal because, and tell us why, and justify that choice by looking at the journal's content and aims of scope, and the fact that it hopefully publishes a lot of key work of interest to your research question. And would you be eligible to publish in this in 18 months' time, 2 years' time, that type of thing. And we want all our published authors to claim their manuscripts and their journal articles at the point of creation, and you do that by getting yourself an ORCID ID. So if you could all register for an ORCID ID if you don't have one already. There it is. If you could click on that. Thank you so much for your participation.